Tonight we bring you a chilling story that exposes the darkest corners of power, betrayal, and justice. When Army Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant is brutally shot by a racist cop, a dangerous conspiracy unfolds that shakes the very foundation of the nation. The Pentagon demands answers, but the truth might be more dangerous than anyone expected. Before we dive in, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on more thrilling stories like this. Now let's get into it. The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets, as Army Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant cruised through the unfamiliar neighborhood. It had been a long day of briefings and classified meetings at the Pentagon, and all he wanted was to get home to his family. His sleek black sedan glided over the asphalt, the soft hum of the tires masking the chaos swirling beneath the calm surface of his mind. Grant was a man of principle, a leader who had fought through the ranks of the military, weathered every storm, and faced down enemy forces with an unwavering resolve. He never backed down from a challenge. But tonight, something felt different. The streets here were darker than usual. It was a part of town he didn't frequent, tucked away in a less savory corner of the city. As Grant's car turned down a side street, he couldn't help but notice the heightened tension in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable, the feeling of being watched. He turned up the radio to drown out the unease creeping into his thoughts. Suddenly, the sharp flash of headlights cut through the rearview mirror. His instinct kicked in. He'd been in enough high-stakes situations to know when something wasn't right. Grant's hand instinctively moved to the dashboard, resting just above the compartment where his firearm was secured. A car was tailing him, keeping a tight distance, too tight for comfort. Grant's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he accelerated slightly, trying to put more distance between him and the mysterious car. But it was no use. The vehicle behind him matched his speed with eerie precision. His pulse quickened, his military training kicked in, and his mind raced. He'd been trained for combat situations, not this, but tonight he felt the weight of every encounter coming to a head. Without warning, the trailing car honked loudly and swerved into the lane beside him, forcing him to swerve sharply to avoid a collision. His heart raced as his car slid sideways. Grant regained control, his military reflexes saving him from disaster. But the other car wasn't done. It immediately swerved back into his lane, now directly in front of him. He saw the flashing lights, the unmistakable blue and red of a police siren. "What the hell?" Grant muttered under his breath. This wasn't a routine stop. He knew that much. His mind was working at full speed, but the suddenness of the situation left him few options. He slowed his car, pulling over to the side of the road. The other vehicle stopped behind him, blocking the street. Before he could react, the sound of car doors slamming shut echoed in the stillness. A shadow moved toward his vehicle, and Grant's instincts flared. He knew something was off. It wasn't just the speed of the pursuit. It was the way the officer moved, his stance, his eyes. The officer was wearing a dark police uniform, but the demeanor was all wrong. His gait was stiff, deliberate. There was no calm professionalism in the air, just an eerie, oppressive tension. Grant's fingers gripped the door handle as the officer approached. He could see the man's face now, hard-set features, eyes burning with unspoken rage. It was all too fast, too surreal. The officer's hand moved to his gun holster, and that's when Grant's training took over. "Wait," Grant shouted, his voice commanding despite the rising tension. But the officer didn't hesitate. His hand flew to his sidearm, drawing it with deadly precision. Grant's heart pounded in his chest. He knew better than to draw his weapon first. It was a cardinal rule for law enforcement encounters. But the officer wasn't playing by the rules. Grant's breath quickened, and everything seemed to slow down as the officer's gun pointed directly at him. His mind raced for a plan, a way out. But before he could make a move, the officer shouted something inaudible, but his voice was full of venom, of hate. Without warning, the officer squeezed the trigger. The world exploded in a blinding flash of pain. The bullet struck with an intensity that threw Grant's body back against the seat, but his military training kicked in, and his body twisted instinctively to shield vital organs. His vision blurred as the force of the shot left him gasping for breath, but he still clung to life. His mind raced to process what was happening. The officer's expression was one of cold satisfaction. Grant's body was on fire, the pain overwhelming him as his vision tunneled. He gasped, struggling to remain conscious. But then, the officer stepped back, his face twisting in something like triumph. "Execution," Grant whispered to himself. This was no accident. This wasn't a routine stop. It was something much darker. He tried to move, to reach for his radio, to alert someone, but everything was slipping away. Blood pooled around him, soaking the seat, as he desperately fought for control. His world was spinning. The darkness was creeping in. In the distance he could hear sirens. Too far, too late. The officer, still watching, stood there, unmoved. He seemed pleased. There was no doubt in Grant's mind now. This wasn't just an attack, it was an execution. The world seemed to fall into a deep, suffocating silence around Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant. The blaring sirens in the distance were growing fainter, and his vision was fading in and out. His thoughts swirled in the dark void of his mind. The initial shock of the gunshot was wearing off, but the pain, oh, the pain was excruciating. His body felt heavy, and his chest constricted with each labored breath. He tried to focus, tried to find the strength to reach for his radio, but it was futile. His hands trembled as he struggled to grip the device. His heart thudded heavily in his chest and his head spun. Time was slipping away and he knew it. As his mind began to cloud, memories flooded his thoughts. His family, his wife, his children, his men, his legacy. The lives he had changed, the wars he had fought. The duty that had always been his driving force. He had never once considered that his own life might be taken in such a brutal, unjust way. The pain he felt wasn't just physical, it was the realization that something terrible was happening, and he couldn't stop it. The officer, no, the cop, was still standing in the street, his figure looming like a dark cloud over the crumpled body of a man who had once held so much power, so much control. But now, Grant was just a broken shell of his former self, bleeding out on the cold concrete. The cop had done what he had set out to do. With an unsettling calm, the officer holstered his weapon, his face devoid of remorse. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. It was as if he had executed a mission, and now it was complete. The cruelty in his eyes made it clear that this was more than just a routine stop. This was something far more sinister. The cop turned, walking away with deliberate steps, ignoring the carnage he had just caused. His movements were cold, calculated. He didn't even glance back at the dying man he had just shot. But the world had a strange way of unraveling the truth, and it wasn't long before a black SUV screeched to a halt, a few feet away. The door swung open, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out. His face was grim, his posture tense. He moved quickly, assessing the situation, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before kneeling beside the wrecked car. "Colonel Grant," the man shouted, panic in his voice. His hands hovered over Grant's bleeding form, unsure of how to help. He knew it was bad. Hell, he knew it was more than bad. The officer had clearly known who Grant was, and that was the problem. The Pentagon would never let this stand. The man quickly pulled out his phone, dialing a number with urgency. He spoke rapidly into the device, giving details, making arrangements. "Get a team here immediately," the man snapped, his voice tight. "We've got a situation." Grant's eyelids fluttered, and he could barely make out the words, but the tone struck him. That was someone from the Pentagon, someone important. But the question echoed in his mind. How far did this go? The sound of distant sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of more police, but not just any police. Those from the upper echelon, the ones trained for this kind of situation. The man in the suit stepped back, looking around as if expecting someone to arrive. He didn't even seem surprised by the cop's brutal act. Then, without warning, the officer who had shot Grant reappeared, stepping into the scene. The air grew tense. The moment felt frozen in time as the officer stared at the man in the suit. Their eyes locked, and for a second it seemed like an unspoken agreement passed between them. "Get in the car," the officer said, his voice low but menacing. The man in the suit took one long look at the officer, then at the fallen Grant. A mix of anger and determination sparked in his eye. "Not without justice," he spat, his voice harsh. The officer's lips curled into a thin, twisted smile, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned away and walked back to the vehicle, leaving a trail of tension hanging in the air. Something was wrong. Something big was happening, and the officer's involvement was just the beginning. The emergency response team arrived, pulling up in sleek black SUV. The first responders were trained, focused, but the real players were just stepping into the scene, the ones who operated in the shadows, pulling strings behind closed doors. The man in the suit turned to one of the officers who had just arrived. "We need a full investigation top level, and it has to go through military channels first," he ordered. "Understood," the officer replied, his voice sharp with authority. But as the officers began processing the scene, the officer who had shot Grant remained calm, standing on the fringes of the chaos. He blended in with the others, as though he was just another part of the operation, but the look in his eyes was cold. There was something deliberate about his presence, something that couldn't be ignored. The scene at the crime scene was now marked for investigation, but it wasn't just a typical shooting. This was a message, and messages like this were never easy to decipher. Across town, high-ranking officials at the Pentagon were receiving the news. An emergency meeting was called, and within minutes, military personnel flooded the conference room, each of them grim-faced and ready for action. The situation was escalating, and the implications were far-reaching. "Get me Colonel Carter," a senior official barked, slamming a fist onto the table. "This goes all the way to the top, and I want answers." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the screen in front of them, where the image of Grant's bloodied car was displayed. "We need to find out who's behind this, and why they did it," the official continued, his voice a low growl. "This wasn't just a random encounter. This was an execution, plain and simple, and we cannot let it go unpunished." The Pentagon was in motion now, and it was clear, this was only the beginning. Shifting back to the officer, there was something unsettling in the way he walked away from the scene. He seemed almost too confident, too sure of himself. It didn't add up, and that was when the next phase of this dark tale began to unfold. Secrets would come to light, and those involved would find themselves caught in a web they had no idea was being spun around them. The next few hours were a whirlwind of chaotic phone calls, emergency meetings, and covert operations within the Pentagon. Senior officials scrambled to take control of the situation, but everyone knew this wasn't just any standard shooting. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a carefully orchestrated attack, and the stakes were high. Colonel Carter arrived at the scene later that night, his face set in stone, his eyes scanning the area with military precision. As a seasoned investigator with years of experience in covert operations, Carter knew this wasn't the work of some random cop gone rogue. This was personal. He kneeled beside the car where Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant had been shot, still alive but barely. Carter could sense the tension in the air, the thick feeling of something much larger at play. The officer involved, the one who had shot Grant, had already vanished. No one knew where he had gone, or who had ordered the execution. But there was one thing Carter was certain of: this was only the beginning. The higher-ups had made their move quickly, sending a highly trained team to investigate the crime scene. But Carter knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary investigation. This would be far more complicated, far more dangerous. The Pentagon wasn't just dealing with a police officer who had gone rogue. This was a well-planned execution, carried out by someone with the power and resources to cover their tracks. As Carter spoke with the officers who were processing the scene, one of them handed him a small device. "We found this in the back seat," the officer said, holding up a phone that appeared to be an encrypted model. Carter examined it carefully, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. This was no ordinary phone. It had a special encryption program, one used only by high-ranking officials or shadow organizations. He pressed the power button, and the screen lit up with a cryptic message. "The game has begun." His blood ran cold. The message was clear, but its implications were still unknown. Who had sent it, and what did they want? The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. Grant's death was part of something much larger, and the people responsible were sending a message. Carter's phone rang, breaking his thought. He didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. "Carter." The voice on the other end was calm, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Get to the Pentagon now. We have intel. The situation's more complicated than we thought. You need to see that." Without wasting any time, Carter returned the phone to the officer and gave him a quick nod. He turned on his heel and marched toward his vehicle. The drive to the Pentagon was long, but his mind was already racing. What was the connection between the officer and Grant's execution? When Carter arrived at the Pentagon, the tension in the air was palpable. The conference room was filled with high-ranking officials, each of them visibly tense, speaking in hushed tones. As he entered, the room fell silent. "You're here," the senior official, General Davis, said, his tone stern but welcoming. "Sit down, Carter. We have a lot to discuss." Carter took a seat at the long table, his eyes scanning the faces of the men and women in the room. He had been involved in military operations his entire career, but this was different. This wasn't just a high-profile military case. This was personal. General Davis wasted no time in getting to the point. "We've just received intel from a very reliable source. The officer who shot Grant wasn't acting alone. He was part of a covert group with ties to extremist organizations. They've been operating under the radar for years. We believe they're involved in multiple high-profile incidents, but until now, they've been careful to cover their tracks." Carter leaned forward, his mind racing. So this wasn't a rogue cop, this was organized. "But why Grant?" "We don't know yet," Davis admitted, his voice tense. "But we believe Grant was targeted specifically. He knew too much. He had access to classified information, and someone wanted him silenced." Carter's heart skipped a beat. "Silenced? You mean executed?" Davis nodded gravely. "Yes, we're not dealing with an isolated incident here, Carter. We're dealing with a systematic attack on our own people, an operation that's been building for years, and it's only just begun." The room was silent as the magnitude of the situation settled in. Carter knew what that meant. If this group had been operating under the radar for years, it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. "Where do we start?" Carter asked, his voice low but firm. "We need to dig deeper. We've traced the encrypted phone to a secure location, but we don't know who's behind it. We need you to follow the trail. We're putting together a team, but we'll need your expertise on the ground. This isn't just about finding a killer. This is about stopping an entire network before they go too far." Carter's mind was already formulating a plan. He had dealt with covert operations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about military protocol or intelligence. This was a fight for survival, and it was one he couldn't afford to lose. He stood up, his resolve hardening. "I'll get on it right away." Back at the crime scene, the officer who had shot Grant was still out there somewhere. Carter knew the officer was connected to the larger operation, but the question was who was pulling the strings, what did they want, and why had they chosen Grant as their first target? Carter's team was already working around the clock to uncover every detail they could, but the deeper they dug, the more questions emerged. The officer's sudden disappearance only added to the mystery. It was clear that whoever was behind this was playing a much bigger game than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, in the shadows, a group of individuals were already plotting their next move. Their mission was far from over. The execution of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant was only the beginning, and they would stop at nothing to achieve their ultimate goal. The hours stretched into days as the Pentagon's investigation team worked tirelessly to uncover the mystery behind Marcus Grant's execution. But despite their efforts, there was little progress. The officer who had shot him remained elusive, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. It was as though someone, or something, was making sure that every trace, every lead was meticulously erased. Colonel Carter's frustration mounted as the walls seemed to close in. He had seen intelligence operations go dark before, but this was different. Every piece of evidence he found only led to more dead ends. The encrypted phone, the message that had been sent, was a dead giveaway that there was something much larger at play. But what? Who had orchestrated Grant's death and why? Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were just out of reach, hidden in plain sight. As Carter sat in his office at the Pentagon staring at the growing pile of files, his mind raced. Something was missing. He had been through every single document, every recorded piece of intelligence, yet there was one detail that kept nagging him. A small, almost insignificant piece of information from Grant's file. A name, a contact, a link to something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. His instincts told him to follow it, to dig deeper, and so he did. With each phone call, with each connection he made, Carter uncovered a chilling truth. The officer who had executed Grant was not just a cop gone rogue. He was a pawn in a much larger game, one that reached into the highest echelons of power. The deeper Carter dug, the more he realized that the officer's disappearance was part of the plan. He had been sent into hiding, erased from the system because the people behind this didn't want him to talk. He was a key player, but there were others more dangerous, more powerful figures pulling the strings. Carter's head spun as the pieces began to fall into place. This was no random attack on a military office. This was a coordinated strike, a calculated move designed to silence someone who had been privy to secrets that could shake the foundations of the government. Meanwhile, outside the Pentagon, the world was starting to take notice. News of Grant's execution had spread like wildfire. Public outcry was growing louder, and calls for justice were swelling. The Pentagon's phone lines were overwhelmed with requests from journalists, politicians, and even foreign governments. Everyone wanted answers, but the truth remained elusive. In the midst of the growing chaos, General Davis called Carter into his office. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. The senior officers present had been reviewing the case for days, but the silence in the room spoke volumes. Carter sat down at the large wooden table, meeting Davis's steely gaze. "We're getting closer," he said, his voice steady despite the pressure mounting inside him. Davis nodded grimly. "Closer isn't enough, Carter. We need every minute we waste is another minute the enemy has to regroup." "I understand, sir," Carter replied. "But I need more time. We're dealing with a network that's been in place for years, maybe even decades. This isn't something we can rush." Davis's jaw clenched. The public's patience is wearing thin. The Pentagon is under intense pressure to solve this. We need to give them something. Anything. Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew Davis was right. The political ramifications of this case were enormous. The murder of a high-ranking officer, a lieutenant colonel no less, would shake the very foundations of the government. But it wasn't just about the military now. It was about national security, about uncovering a network of corruption and secrecy that could threaten everything they stood for. "We need to find the officer," Carter said, his voice firm. "We need to figure out who is protecting him, and why. Whoever did this is too organized, too methodical. They've covered their tracks too well, and that means they're not just targeting Grant. They're targeting all of us." Davis's eyes narrowed. "I want you to take a team, go underground, get into the streets, into the shadows where these people operate. We're done with the formal channels. It's time to play their game." Carter's heart raced. He had worked in the shadows before, but this was different. This was personal. Back at the crime scene, the investigation continued, but there were no breakthroughs. The officer who had executed Grant had vanished completely, and with him went all the potential leads. It was as though he had never existed. Carter had made up his mind. He was going to track this officer down no matter what it took. He gathered a small team of operatives, men and women from within the military intelligence community, who specialized in covert operations. Their mission was clear: infiltrate the city, follow the trail, and find out who was behind the officer's disappearance. The team moved quickly, moving through the city in the dead of night, blending in with the shadows as they searched for anything that could lead them to the truth. They were going off the grid, operating outside the law, doing whatever was necessary to get the answers they needed. But even as Carter and his team combed the streets, something darker was at work. The people who were behind this execution were always one step ahead. They had eyes everywhere. As Carter's team infiltrated hidden networks, they were met with resistance at every turn. False leads, disinformation, and even sabotage were becoming part of the operation. Someone was trying to stop them, someone who knew exactly what they were up to. Back at the Pentagon, the pressure was building. The nation's eyes were on them. Political leaders demanded answers. The media was relentless, pressing for information that the Pentagon was not yet ready to give. But it wasn't just the public that was demanding answers. It was the enemies within their own government who had their own agenda, dark forces that had infiltrated the highest levels of power. And the deeper Carter dug, the more he realized that his mission to uncover the truth might very well cost him everything: his career, his life, and the trust of those he had sworn to protect. But there was no turning back now. The night was thick with tension as Carter and his team continued to push deeper into the labyrinth of corruption and betrayal. They had followed a series of dead ends, each more confusing than the last. But one thing was clear: the officer who had shot Grant was just the beginning. The deeper they went, the more entangled they became in a conspiracy that reached far beyond the streets of the city. Carter's team had infiltrated some of the darkest corners of the underworld, tracing illicit dealings and connections that extended into political offices, military circles, and even shadow organizations that had operated for decades under the radar. But with each step forward, the stakes grew higher. They were no longer just investigating the murder of one officer. They were uncovering a deeply embedded network that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the nation's security. And just as they were on the verge of a breakthrough, disaster struck. A close contact, a source Carter had trusted, was found dead in an alley, his body mutilated beyond recognition. A message was left nearby, one written in blood. "You're too late." It was a chilling warning. Someone knew they were getting too close. Someone was watching their every move. Carter's heart sank as he saw the body of his contact, a trusted informant who had been feeding him information about the officer and the people behind the attack on Grant. He knew they had crossed a line now. The network they were dealing with wasn't just dangerous, it was ruthless, and it had the power to silence anyone who stood in its way. As Carter stood over the body of his fallen contact, his mind raced. He couldn't back down now. They had come too far. They had to finish what they had started, even if it meant risking everything. But the price of the truth was steep, and Carter could feel the weight of the danger pressing down on him like a vice. Back at the Pentagon, General Davis had received the news. The assassination of Carter's contact had sent shockwaves through the military establishment. There was no denying it anymore. The operation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. The officer who had killed Grant was part of something far larger, and now it was clear. The Pentagon was not just dealing with an isolated group of extremists. They were up against a well-coordinated, shadowy organization that had infiltrated the highest levels of power. Davis stood in front of a room filled with senior military officials, his face grim. "We have no choice now," he said, his voice low. "This goes beyond just Marcus Grant. This is about national security. We're dealing with enemies within our own ranks, people who are willing to kill to protect their secrets, and they won't stop until we're all gone." His words hung in the air, thick with gravity. Carter knew that time was running out. The more they uncovered, the more powerful the people behind this network became. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. And the Pentagon was in the crosshairs. Carter's next steps were clear. He would take the fight directly to the heart of the conspiracy. No more playing by the rules. No more waiting for the right moment. It was time to expose the people behind the execution of Grant and bring them to justice, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, Carter and his team uncovered shocking revelations. They discovered that the officer who had killed Grant was just one piece of a much larger operation, a covert faction within the government, made up of rogue elements with ties to military contractors, political elites, and even foreign powers. This faction had been orchestrating a series of operations designed to destabilize the government, erode trust in the military, and push the country toward a new world order. Carter realized that Marcus Grant had been targeted because of his knowledge that had the potential to expose the conspiracy and unravel everything they had worked to build. The officer and the faction behind him had seen Grant as a threat, and his execution was meant to silence him before he could expose their plans. But the deeper Carter dug, the more horrifying the truth became. This wasn't just about power, it was about control. The faction had been working in the shadows for years, manipulating events, planting false narratives, and eliminating anyone who stood in their way. Grant had been one of the few people who had stumbled upon their secrets, and they had made sure he wouldn't live to tell the tale. With the evidence in hand, Carter returned to the Pentagon, ready to face the full force of the conspiracy. But as he walked into the meeting room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. General Davis was sitting at the head of the table, his face pale, his hands shaking as he looked at a screen in front of him. "Carter," Davis said, his voice barely a whisper. "We have a problem." "What do you mean?" Carter asked, his heart racing. Davis hesitated before speaking. "The people behind this, they're in here, right now. They've infiltrated the highest levels of the military, and they've been controlling everything from the inside. We've been blindsided, Carter. We can't trust anyone." Carter's mind went into overdrive. They had always suspected that something was off, but now it was clear. The conspiracy ran deep, so deep that it had reached the very heart of the Pentagon itself. The walls around Carter seemed to close in, and for the first time in his career, he realized that the fight for justice wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival, and the people behind Marcus Grant's death would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. As Carter prepared for the final confrontation, he knew one thing for certain: no one was safe. The enemy was everywhere, and they had already won. The only thing left to do was make sure they didn't get away with the full extent of the conspiracy now exposed. The Pentagon launched an all-out effort to dismantle the rogue faction from within. Carter and his team worked around the clock, coordinating with trusted allies to bring those responsible to justice. But as the operation unfolded, it became clear that there was still much more at stake than anyone had realized. In the end, the execution of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Grant had been just the beginning. The network they had uncovered was more powerful, more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. But Carter, driven by the memory of his fallen friend and the need for justice, refused to let it go. The battle was far from over, and though the conspiracy had been exposed, the cost of uncovering the truth had been steep. For Carter, it was a price he would pay for the rest of his life. This concludes the story of Army Lieutenant Colonel shot by racist cop. Pentagon demands justice after police execution. I hope you found the suspenseful journey gripping, and the character's development satisfying.